A very good morning to all who are joining us in this webinar today. This is Sally Chew from Temasek Polytechnic, bringing you yet another complimentary live webinar jointly brought to you by the Singapore Training and Development Association, better known here in Singapore as STADA, and the Center for Transcultural Studies at Temasek Polytechnic. We do hope that through such live webinars, we can contribute to the building of learning communities, connect practitioners, learners, leaders, as part of STADA's vision to embrace people and extend boundaries. People want to know they matter, and they want to be treated as people. And that's what Pamela Stroko said in the new talent contract today. Our theme for today's live webinar is connection culture. And for the next hour, we will be hearing from Michael Lee Stallard, President of E Pluribus Partners, a leadership and consulting firm based in Connecticut, also the co-founder of connectingculture.com. He speaks and teaches in a variety of organizations, including Google, Johnson & Johnson, the Scotiabank, the University of Virginia's Darden Graduate School of Business, the US Treasury, and I can go on and on. But I'll leave that to Mike to share with you during his presentation. He is also the primary author of Connection Culture, The Competitive Advantage of Shared Identity, Empathy, and Understanding at Work, and Fired Up or Burnt Out, How to Reignite Your Team's Passion. Michael, prior to founding his company, worked in a variety of places, including Morgan Stanley, Charles Schwab. He was also at one time the Chief Marketing Officer with a background in investment banking, finance, business development at places like Barclays, Texas Instruments, just to name a few. And more interestingly, besides a marketing degree from the Illinois State U, an MBA from the University of Texas, and a JD from DePaul Law School in Chicago, Illinois, he is also a lawyer admitted to the bar in 1991. I don't think he has anything contentious for us or litigious for us to talk about this morning, but he has something more inclusive to share with us this morning, all about connections and how important it is in the area of employee engagement. Michael, all over to you now.
Okay, Sally, thank you very much. Let me just can see my slides. Can you see my slides now?
Coming on, yes, thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, so we had a book that came out about a month ago called Connection Culture, The Competitive Advantage of Shared Identity, Empathy, and Understanding at Work. And I'm delighted that it's released on Amazon.com in leadership training. It was reviewed in the Financial Times in London a couple weeks ago. Part of the reason we think we had a book that came out in 2007 that introduced some of these ideas. Now people are really sensing the importance of connection. I think part of it is that research has shown that the millennial generation, and in particular World Group, an advertising agency, did a couple of years, and they're redoing it again this summer, that showed the #1 value of the millennial generation worldwide is connection. So anyway, we think that just connection has become much more important, given that it is the highest generation, and they're going to dominate the workforce in the not too distant future. One of the things we're focused on. Now, just a bit in terms of terminology, managers, when I use the term manager, it's meant to describe individuals who have responsibility for tasks and organizing resources and people. And people in the workplace follow a manager because they have authority. So they hire, they fire, they make promotion decisions, they make compensation decisions, and they have that power. So people will naturally fire them because they want to earn a living. But there's a difference between the manager with people. In addition to, they have that authority, they have that formal authority, but that if the leader also has the ability to, that's what makes people want to follow. And it affects a host of behaviors. It's everything from giving their best efforts to aligning their behavior with organizational goals, with the leader's goals, communicating so that the leader gets the best information to make optimal decisions, and helping the team or the department improve what they're doing. So there's a difference between a manager and a leader, and every manager's aspiration become a leader. And you see that in the research too. Now this particular employee engagement numbers globally, it shows that only about 13% of employees globally are engaged, so that they're giving their best efforts. So there's an improvement. And in the best organizations, leaders will engage 6 out of 10 employees. So that 3 out of 10 number that you see for managers, that's it's actually 1 out of 8 employees globally are engaged. But like I said, in the best organizations, you will find 6 or more employees out of 10 who are giving their best efforts. And in the very best, among the very best leaders, you'll see those numbers up above 8. 80% of employees who are engaged and feel connected and giving their best efforts. And of course, that has a huge impact on performance, because people just have more energy and enthusiasm. They're giving their best efforts, aligning their behavior with the leader's goals, and that affects the bottom line. So the missing link between the manager and the leader is connection, this element of connection that we're going to talk about. Now, there are 3 types of relational or social relations. We describe the first culture as a culture of control, and that's a culture where people who have power, control, influence, and status, they rule over others. And it creates over time a sense of somewhat helplessness on the part of employees who don't have as much power, and even hopelessness in some cases. Now, we also find that a culture that's rapidly growing around the world is the culture of indifference. And let me just describe that. That's the culture where people are so busy with tasks, they feel like they have too much email and text messages, and maybe they're spending more time commuting, working longer hours. They just have maybe too many things on their plate, and it's squeezing out time for supportive relationships in the workplace. And as a result, people start to feel unsupported, left out, or lonely, all of which are very bad from a biological standpoint, and we'll get into that in just a minute. This culture is what we call a culture of connection. That's where people have supportive relationships in the workplace. They have connection to their work because it's a good fit with their strengths. Be a challenge. It's not over-challenging so that they're bored. It's not under-challenging so that, it's not over-challenging so that they're stressed out. Not under-challenging so that they're bored, but it provides the right degree of challenge so that they're stimulated and enthusiastic about their work. They also feel connected to their supervisor. They have a good relationship with their supervisor and with the people they work with. They also feel connected to the organization's leadership, its the organization's mission, its values, and its reputation. And those connections really have an effect on people, both neurotransmitters in their brains and the endocrine system in their body, which I'll describe in just a minute. So culture affects biology, and what we have found, in the new book we have an entire chapter on the science of connection. That's my favorite chapter because I just find it fascinating how this was, earlier in my career, this was a factor that was not on my radar screen. I was working long hours in investment banking, commuting from Connecticut to Midtown Manhattan. My job was very demanding, and even when I was home, I was often thinking about my job. My job really squeezed out time for relationships in my life, and as a result, I feel lonely. It affected my health, It affected my attitude. I didn't feel well. I needed more coffee in the morning to get going, and alcohol at night to slow down, and it spiraled down from a very negative effect on me. And actually, there's a professor at Wharton who has studied this effect in the investment banking community, and just how often, because people have such demanding work hours, and they're suffering from loneliness, their bodies start to fight back, is what's happening. So this continuum that you see on this diagram is very relevant to organizational performance and individual performance. So you see on the left that the individual who feels connected, supported, included in their workplace, that will have this effect on their body. It's an effect that biologists call just homeostasis, which in other words means the body is at a state of balance. Blood, glucose, which is a form of sugar, and oxygen is circulated throughout the body at the levels that the bodily systems need to perform at the top of their game, so to speak, and to be healthy for a long period of time. However, when people feel disconnected, when they feel unsupported, when the body perceives threats in the environment, and we move into a state that's called the stress response. So our bodies, amazingly, allocate blood, glucose, and oxygen to what is called the heart, the lungs, and the thighs. It's preparing the body to fight or flee because it perceives a threat. Now, if this is a short-term state of stress because you're running from a tiger, say for example, that's good, right? You move faster to get out of harm's way to protect yourself. However, if you're stuck in this state of stress response because you're experiencing psychological stress, it's like the gas pedal on a car being glued to the car. The engine is revving way beyond a level that that is healthy to operate for a long period of time, and it'll eventually burn out the motor. Well, essentially the same thing's happening in the human body. If your body is stuck in a state of stress response so that the bodily systems are allocating blood, glucose, and oxygen to the systems I mentioned before, the heart, the lungs, the thighs, the big muscles, in other words, but at the same time depleting resources from the brain, the digestive system, the immune system, so that we're more vulnerable to sickness, and the reproductive system. And that just, if you're stuck in that state, it has an effect on how you feel. It has an effect on your judgment, your creativity, your sense of joy in the workplace, and your lifespan. It will shave years off your life. In fact, the general rule is that if you're in a state of high stress, that the 1 year of being in a high state of stress is equivalent to 7 years in your lifespan in terms of being in a state of homeostasis. Now, that's a very high degree of stress. That's, say, for example, taking care of a disabled child is creates a great deal of stress if someone's doing it alone. And so we age very rapidly under those conditions. And what we found is creating a culture that produces this state of homeostasis in the body boosts individual performance, and no surprise, when people are performing at the top of their ability and they're giving their best efforts and aligning their behavior, it has an effect on the bottom line of organizations too. And of course, these principles I'm talking about, they apply not only in the workplace, but they apply to your families at home or your friends in the community. So this is very relevant to all of your life. Now, I'm using this term connection a lot, and let me just define it. Connection is a bond between people, and it's based on 3 factors: shared identity, empathy, and understanding. And those factors move self-centered individuals, that's all of us essentially, towards group-centered membership. So we begin to, when we feel the sense of connection to others, then we care more about the work of the group, and we're willing to sacrifice our own interests at times for the sake of the group, because we believe we're serving a cause greater than self, oftentimes. So that's what we're talking about here, this state of connection. And it is a great thing to experience a state of connection, and tragic not to over the course of your career. Now, this is our basic model. Let me just walk you through this. So what we find is most managers focus on task excellence and results, and that's good, right? You know, we're paid to produce results and achieve excellence in the work that we do. But the problem is that's not enough. If we just focus on tasks and results, then it's not sustainable, because we're human beings and not machines. And there are certain conditions we have to live in terms of culture, the culture we're in, so that we operate at a healthy, ongoing state. And that's what you see in that center block. Relationship excellence. So it's a combination of task excellence and relationship excellence that produces sustainable, superior performance. And we describe relationship excellence as creating this connection culture. And you can see in that diagram that it has the three arrows represent what we call the 3V connection culture leadership model. It just stands for vision, value, and voice. And when you have vision, value, and voice in place, which I'll explain in a minute, it creates a sense of connection among all the people. Leaders are individuals who have authority and who people want to follow because they feel connected to them. And employees of the organization, they don't feel just like hired guns for the organization. They feel a sense of membership, a sense of ownership that makes them want to give their best efforts, and that aids in performance. Now, the opposite of the culture of control difference that I talked about earlier, they produce the same effect. They isolate people. They isolate managers. They isolate employees. And when they don't, people feel unsupported, left out, and lonely. But it also produces another sinister, I think, effect on creating what I describe as knowledge traps. Now, a knowledge trap is when the knowledge exists in the organization to make the best decision or to innovation that improves performance. But because of the culture, in other words, the knowledge doesn't get from one person to another to the individual who needs the knowledge to make the best decision. So one of my clients, for example, is the NASA Johnson Space Center, the space agency for the United States. And on 2 occasions, the 2 space shuttle disasters where the space shuttles blew up, in both instances, the knowledge existed inside the organization to make the right decision in place that prevented the knowledge from getting from an employee to a decision maker who could make the decision to address the threat. And it led to managerial failure and the loss of 2 space shuttles and their so there's a lot that's been written and studied about those 2 examples. There are many others. Oftentimes managerial failure really comes back to this dynamic that we're seeing often in the organization, but it's trapped because of a failure of connection. And these relationship traps come in several types. In some cases, they are, it may be a manager who doesn't seek the opinions and ideas of others. It may be that the manager blocks an employee from sharing information with other parts of the organization because there's a rivalry or a silo behavior between departments or competing with one another. It could be that the organization has an isolationist attitude and there's not the organization that could help them improve performance. but they are not intentional about seeking that knowledge in the organization. So there are a number of different types of knowledge traps. In some cases, they're cultural traps, where people may not be communicating different languages, or they are struggling from a cultural standpoint to communicate. Knowledge traps. So that's the culture of control difference. Okay, let me give you the definitions. And after this, I'll give you an example of a unique team that's been wildly successful in culture. The first element is a vision. We also call it shared identity, and let me just define it. It's when everyone in the organization is motivated by the mission, united by the values, and proud of the reputation. Let me just unpack this for a moment. You know, where we're going, that's pretty obvious. I think of what comes to mind is Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center is the #1 cancer center in the U.S. It's based in New York City, not far from where I am, and an organization I'm very familiar with. Their mission is to provide care anywhere. And that's a mission that really motivates a lot of employees there, because oftentimes their lives have been touched by cancer in some way. It's affected them or a loved one. Or a friend. United by the values. Some of the values you find in that organization are, there's a passion for excellence, and that's reflected in the organization being rated the #1 US. They also they care about people, and you see that in the way they interact with people. Just a reputation that they are proud of. The reputation of an organization, you know, people are either embarrassed by, they're indifferent to, or they're proud of. When they're proud, it creates that sense of connection among the people. And I remember in one instance, I was actually at the cancer center, and I overheard they were reporting the results of an employee engagement or satisfaction survey, and I listened to the employees, and they talked about how they loved their mission to provide the best cancer care anywhere. And these are the words they use. They loved their patients and their families, and they loved the people they work with. And I just saw this sense of connection among the people who work there. It was such a contrast to what I had seen, quite honestly, Wall Street across on the other side of Manhattan. So there was this strong sense of connection, and they knew that at one of the best cancer centers in the world. So there was a great deal of connection and pride in that organization. So that's the vision part. The second, and I call this the heart of a connection culture, and that is that there's human value. That people are valued not just because they're resources to achieve an end, but because they're living, breathing human beings. When you have a culture that values people, it creates a sense of shared empathy. People are sensitive to one another's feelings and emotions, and that has a positive effect. And it's really interesting when you study this, because our brains have these almost like a Wi-Fi system that allows us to feel another person's, they're called mirror neurons. We have the ability to feel what another human being feels, and when we feel their joy, it enhances their feeling of joy. When we feel their pain, it diminishes the pain they feel. In a sense, it's a sharing of the pain. And the effect of those two, whether it's feeling their joy or feeling their pain, is it connects. And so this is very powerful in terms of creating that where people support one another through difficult times and just adversity that all organizations and all people experience in the course of life. So the definition of value is when people understand the needs of people, and we could go deeper into that. We talk about in the book there are 6 universal human needs to thrive in the workplace, and just briefly they are respect, recognition, belonging, autonomy, personal growth, and meaning. And when those needs are met, people describe it as feeling connected to the people they work with, to their organization's identity. So those are the 6 needs. And in these cultures, then moving on to the second point, people appreciate the positive, unique contribution of colleagues. So they're affirming them. They're recognizing their contributions. And it comes in two forms. They will either recognize their task excellence contributions. So for example, maybe the individual is a good engineer, a good petroleum geophysicist, or they will affirm their character strengths. Maybe they're persevering, or they have a passion for excellence, or they're they're open-minded. All those things are character strengths, and you just find people are encouraged and affirmed by this, and it energizes them. And then finally, in these cultures, people help one another, and it comes in two forms. They help people improve, so it could be through honest feedback that's given in a sensitive way, an encouraging way to encourage people to improve, or it could be to help them through just the difficult times they've had. People have a sickness or health of a loved one, loss of a loved one. You know, those things affect our performance and work too. And so people reach out and help one another. I don't know if you saw, there's a lot in the press in recent days about a Facebook post that Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, wrote after her husband passed away. And you see it in that, just how her colleagues at work and her friends really reached out to help her in the depths of grief. And just, it was a beautiful post about just how grateful she was for people who helped save her and get through this really tough time that she's had with her husband dying at such a young age. And so these things, this valuing huge effect on motivation, on enthusiasm, on energy, on effort, etc. Okay, and then the third element of a connection culture is, and we see that in organizations, or shared, it creates a shared understanding. And this happens in organizations where people seek the ideas of others. In other words, they have humility. They know that they don't have all the answers, and the opinions of others and ideas of others. And people ask them their opinions and ideas. They speak honestly. They don't tell them just what they think that person wants to hear, especially if they have power, but they have the courage to speak the truth. And you know, that can be challenging to do at times. That can be risky to do at times. But in the best organizations, honesty is rewarded and embraced and encouraged. And you know, what you might call constructive friction or creative friction, it's recognized as just part of the process. It's something we have to get to the best decisions. Because that creative friction, that constructive friction, can create some knowledge traps. If people people's feelings are hurt, then they're sensitive to the risk of that, and they know how to repair those broken relationships when they happen. So they're quick to apologize to their teammates, the benefit of the doubt that they didn't intend to say something that was hurtful. And so this restores those relationships so that knowledge traps don't build up. So that's the definition of the 3V leadership model: vision, value, voice. Now, you know, let me just, well, I'm going to get to the case study in just a minute. I just want to comment on one part of the research. Now, there's so much research that supports this in a number of fields. The social sciences, psychology and social psychology and sociology. But let me just comment on the neuroscience of the allocation of blood glucose and oxygen. But also, and this is something, I saw you had David Rock on earlier, and this is a big thing in the area of neuroscience, is when people feel connected, very positive effect on neurotransmitters in our brains and hormones throughout our body. And the gist of it is, when we feel connected and safe, the brain activity stays in the frontal lobes of the brain, what's called the cortex or the prefrontal cortex. But that's the part of the brain where we make rational decisions, where and having brain activity at the frontal cortex is a good thing when we're making decisions in an organizational or team context. But when we feel the amygdala, which is processed at a subconscious level and we sense the amygdala's processing in the form of emotion. So we may feel anxiety, we may feel a panic attack, but we sense there's a threat, and there's a higher probability when that happens that we will make a decision rather than a rational decision. And that's oftentimes when organizations can do some damage, when they're not really thinking through the reacting threat. And that applies to managers and teams as well. So, sense of connection, it keeps the body in that state of homeostasis so that we're making the best decisions and performing. And in the research, you see that they're more enthusiastic, they're more energetic, mentally and physically more trusting, more productive, more cooperative, more creative. They're better problem solvers. And you see this in, no surprise, if individuals are performing better because they're experiencing that state of connection rather than feeling unsupported, left out, and alone, it goes to say that the organization would perform better. And the data confirms that. We see in organizations where people feel connected and engaged that employees are 20% more productive than the average employee in the average organization, and they're 87% less likely to leave the organization. Every measure, every business outcome that has been assessed moves in a favorable direction in business units where employees So in other words, data and the hard facts and evidence and research, it's rational to conclude that we should be intentional about creating connection in the workplace as well as in other domains in our life. So connection equals thriving in life, disconnection equals dysfunction in terms of our performance, and it has an effect, results in, it contributes to premature death. And this applies both to individuals and to organizations. And in fact, if you look at, and I just have American data on this, but the Fortune 500 companies have an average lifespan of less than 50 years, which is quite extraordinary when you think about the size and reach and scale of these organizations, that they last less than the lifespan of the average individual in America. So, and oftentimes it's this lack of connection that sabotages their performance. Okay, let me just stop here a minute. A quick story before we get in a little bit more into the lead. Let me just give you the story of, because when you think about culture, the most important cultures are the cultures at the local level. In other words, what culture do you live and work in on a day-to-day basis? Primarily with the people you interact with, whether it's your team and your department. That's the culture that has the greatest effect on you and the performance of that local business unit. And this is an unusual example. It's a rock band, but the rock band really it's a team. It's a department. It's not a huge organization. It's more akin to the size of a team that you would see in most organizations. And the rock band I want to take a look at is the rock band U2. Now, this is a band that started in the mid-'70s. It was 14 and 15-year-old boys. When they started, they were not very good. In fact, it wasn't unusual that people booed and laughed at them. So, in particular, had some talent, had some problems. The two band members that were talented, the lead guitar player, if you're familiar with that band, and Larry Mullen Jr., who's the drummer, a bit of talent at that young age. But Bono, the lead singer, who most people know because he's in the press a lot, he tended to scream more than sing. Now, I think he was an engaging performer. Great. Bass player, Adam Clayton, he looked like a rock star, but he owned a guitar. So he really had some performance problems. And the band was not very good, and they improved over time. And now, 40 years later, more awards. In the States, we call them Grammy Awards. They won more Grammy Awards than any band in history. And they have surpassed the Rolling Stones for having the highest revenue concert tour in history. So on two very objective measures, they have been wildly successful. And when you look at those guys, they are relatively healthy, and their careers could still go on for another decade or two. So it'll be interesting to see where they take it. They're still taking risks, and their music. So I think some of the best days could still be ahead in that rock band. So Bono says that we're different than most bands, and you see the connection culture is created by Bono. He's a singer, the lyricist, so he writes all the lyrics, and he is not admit to being. Study the band. He is definitely a leader among equals, almost a partnership type culture with Bono. And you see that Bono communicates an inspiring vision, and he lives it, people, and he gives them a voice. Those three things create a tremendous sense of connection. First of all, Bono has said that U2 is different than most bands. He says we're musicians and performers. But in addition to that, we have music, we have ideas in our music. Our rights, social justice, and matters of faith, and those are things that are important to us. And so we're like traveling salesmen who have a point of view that we're communicating through our music and our influence outside of music. And that makes us very different than most bands. We're not just in it for the money. Bono, he walks the talk. When you look at Bono and his wife Allie, they've created philanthropies that help the poor, particularly in Africa. And so human rights, social justice, and matters of faith are very important to him. He walks the talk. Secondly, he values people. And you see several aspects of the band's culture. Number one, they split their economic profits in 5 equal ways between the 4 band members and their manager. In most bands, the megastar like Bono would take half the profits or more, but they split the profits 5 equal ways. Secondly, he's always recognizing his colleagues. He has, if you words in the press, you'll hear him talk about how he's a lousy guitar player. He says, I think he's overstating that, but he says because of these talented friends of his, together they bring the music to life. And he also always affirms their character strengths. He has said that, he said, why would I ever want to leave this band? Because when I'm around these guys, they just make me a better person. And so he's always finding positive things to uplift his teammates. And they appreciate that. They respond to that. And then thirdly, they help one another. And you see this very early in the band's story. About a year after they formed, Larry Mullen Jr., a drummer, his mother was hit and killed in a car accident. Bono reached out to him and helped him get through a tough time. And of course, Bono's mother had died just a couple years earlier. And so he knew what he was going through, and Bono reached out and really helped him get through a tough time. Some years later, when the band was offered a recording contract with the condition that they replace Larry because he's an unconventional drummer in terms of his style, Bono told the record company no. It was all or none. And at that time, they were under severe economic stress, so it was tough to turn down their first contract offer from a huge record label, A&M Records. But they did, and they persisted. And they helped Ed through divorce and through the sickness of his daughter. Adam Clayton developed a drug and alcohol addiction. He's the one band member with a fast life at times, and he showed up at a performance so wasted drugs that he couldn't perform, and they had a member of their entourage perform for him. They had to decide, do we throw him overboard for failing to perform, or do we stick with him? And they decided that they adopted, we're going to get through this alive, and they overcome this drug and alcohol addiction. And even Bono has had some difficult times. He's received death threats happened there before they played a concert. He received a note that said, if you play the song Pride, most of it in the name of love is what it sounds like, but it's actually the name of the song is Pride. It's about the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And obviously a racist individual wrote a note to Bono and said, if you play that song, I'm going to blow your effing head off. And the FBI in the U.S. told the band that they felt it was a credible threat that they needed to take seriously. But they decided they were not going to back down. They went on stage, they performed the song, and Bono closed his eyes at a certain part of the song that talks about a shot that rang out in the sky in Memphis when Dr. King was assassinated. And Bono closed his eyes as he sang that and thought, you know, what if there is someone out there who's going to take a shot at me? And when he opened his eyes, to his surprise, the bass player, Adam Clayton, had actually walked over and stood in front of him. Now it was extraordinary. And in fact, when they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Bono thanked Adam for being willing to take a bullet for him. Now, I'm not saying you need to take a bullet for a colleague, but you know, it just shows how extraordinarily connected these guys are. They're like family to one another, and you're not going to find that in many teams. But moving in that direction is a great thing in terms of performance. And then finally, let me add that Bono gives them a voice in decision making, and the way they make their decisions is if any one of the band members strongly opposes a particular direction, then they won't go in that direction. And so if three members want to go and one opposes it but doesn't strongly oppose it, they'll go in the direction. But if somebody strongly opposes it, they won't. And Bono says, you know, this takes more time to work through our differences. It's frustrating at times, but we believe it produces superior results. And certainly their track record supports that. So those things that I talked about, Bono's communicating an inspiring vision and living it, valuing people and giving them a voice, creates a tremendous amount of connection among these band members. And now they have been together all of their adult lives, and they have really, they're certainly right up there, one of the most successful rock bands in history. Now, what I just described, what I call the 3V leadership model, vision, value, voice, that creates connection, it's simple, it's memorable, and it's actionable. And that's what we're finding people like about it, because most managers don't have time for for complex leadership models. They really need something that's simple, that's memorable, that's actionable. And that's what the 3V model is. And there it is written out: to create a connection culture, communicate an inspiring vision, value people, and give them a voice. That will move cultures of indifference or cultures of control to cultures of connection, so that everybody feels like part of the team. So to create this culture, now we have in the book and in our materials, we've identified, oh gosh, well over 100 different attitudes, language, and behaviors, both individual and organizational, to create a sense of connection. We've been studying this for over a decade now at places like the engineering section of the NASA Johnson Space Center, Google, Ford Motor Company. I was just out at Qualcomm. Last week I was at the Government Accountability Office, part of the U.S. Congress. So we've been studying this in a wide variety of cultures for more than a decade now, and just identifying the attitudes, language, and behavior that creates connection. And let me just give you a quick example. I mentioned Pfizer. I have an article coming out in the next few days in the quarterly journal of the American Management Association, and it talks about Pfizer's culture. And one of the things that they do is, one attitude that Ian Reed had, who's the CEO of Pfizer, was he wanted to create a place that was very honest and open, where people would share what they were thinking rather than withhold it. And so that was an attitude that creates connection in an organization, when people can voice their beliefs. And so Ian came up with this idea called straight talk. And they actually produced a coin. And the whole idea is, when somebody wanted to speak the truth, they would pull out their straight talk coin, put it on the desk, and say, I need to talk straight here. And well, I think the coin kind of went by the wayside. But what stuck was, if you go around the world at Pfizer, people will use the term in the language of, in the spirit of straight talk. So, for example, if I need to speak up and say I'm concerned about a compliance issue, I would use the language, in the spirit of straight talk, I think I need to say this. And so it's given people language around the world to use that really reinforces this attitude of openness and honesty that gives people a voice. And the behaviors you see are, they have training, they have organizational training on, how to communicate in ways that won't create knowledge traps and, will result in effective communication. They encourage straight talk, and you see it in individual behavior of leaders, that they're living up to this straight talk, and they're not. If somebody tells them something that they don't want to hear, they're not punishing them. So these things. That's just one example of creating a connection culture in terms of finding the right attitudes, language, and behavior that advances a culture to become a connection culture. So, and we believe people don't drift towards this, leaders don't drift towards this. It's something we need to be very intentional about training leaders that they are responsible for creating culture. And in the absence of being intentional about it, they're still creating culture. It's just not the culture they want nor the culture that the organization wants. And then secondly, we're big believers in designing and implementing employee engagement surveys. That we design them. So if you look at employee engagement surveys, they're all about connection and values. And so we're big believers in custom employee engagement surveys. I think, in the last few months, we did a advertising agency in 16 different languages. And we worked with the CEO, and he, as a result, has made some leadership changes. For one thing, he elevated Brian Crawford, who is the leader of foot cone belting in New Zealand, and made Brian vice chairman in the entire organization, because Brian had done a tremendous job making FCB New Zealand one of the most exciting, one of the most creative and productive advertising agency branches in the world. And so he's been elevated to help the other managers create a connection culture throughout the organization. And then finally, tools like we all need mentors and coaches. Nobody gets to be great at anything without a coach. You just think about world-class athletes. They all have a coach or multiple coaches, and that's true with leadership too. We all need mentors or coaches and getting honest feedback to help us see areas we need to develop. And so we're big believers in that. So I'm about ready to conclude. I think we've got a lot of time that we can take questions and talk. The book that's come out, and let me just encourage you to take a look at the website, because the website, connectionculture.com, has a 9-question survey you can take that will tell you what type of culture you're working in, whether it's a culture of control, a culture of connection, or a culture of indifference. In the book we have, and on the website also, I should add, there are sample chapters. There's also, if you go to epluribuspartners.com, our corporate website, and click on articles, we have articles that have been published all over the world with many of our case studies. So, and also I write regularly for foxbusiness.com, the Fox network. And so there are a lot of examples there about Ford and sports stories. We just wrote one on FC Barcelona, the soccer football team. So anyway, let me just stop here, because I want to hear from you. That I've shared with you kind of the vision of our work of the connection culture versus the other cultures in the 3V leadership model. What questions do you have?
Thank you, Michael. That was certainly very simple, memorable, and actionable. Joining us in today's live webinar, we have people from ConocoPhillips Indonesia, Civil Service Commission Philippines, staff and students from Temasek Polytechnic. Let me see who is very simple.
Okay.
Okay, I think let me kick off with the first question, Sally, if you don't mind. Well, I first must apologize for not so well dressed as with a shirt and tie. I'm actually resting because I have a flu at home. So, but I think the topic from Michael was interesting enough for me to want to lock in. I think what Michael has shared is interesting and is really about connection. Now, I need to ask Michael this question. For someone to be really connected, how do you link connection to this word called trust and building trust before somebody would totally let go and connect with you? Michael, maybe your comment on that?
Okay. So trust, thank you, sir, by the way, for your question. Trust and connection are very closely related. They're very highly correlated, although they're different in terms of what we're looking at. But where you find high trust, you will find high connection. And the way I think about trust is that trust comes from several factors. Number one, perceived competence. You know, is the person we're working with that we hope to trust, are they competent? And so competence being number one. Second, reliability. Do they do what they say they're going to do? Third, intimacy, which just means, do we know them? Do we really have a history with them? Do we know their story? Do we know what's important to them? And then those all have a positive effect on trust and connection, but it can be undermined by perception of self-interest if they're focusing on their own interest versus our interest and not trying to find a win-win situation. So, you know, there are different ways of looking at things that are both highly correlated and similar. It's just a different way of looking at it. It's one lens through which in culture building.
But just to take on a further question without trying to monopolize your question time, and that is, do you see a difference when you talk about trust from the Western perspective or the Asian perspective? Is there a fundamental difference in terms of relationship building?
You know, I would love to hear your perspective on that. What do you think?
Back to you, Robert.
Yeah, looks like it. Yeah, I think that there are some fundamental difference between the way Westerners approach trust and the way Asians approach trust. Meaning that from the Asian context, trust is fundamentally a approach where we start on the basis of relationship building at the first point of contact. From the Western perspective, I note that it always starts with a business transaction perspective first, and then you go on to a relationship building. I think fundamentally that is the main shift or emphasis that if we are to be a global connected community, we need to somehow strike a balance.
Well, I completely agree with that. And let me just add that one of my concerns is that Americans have become so task and transaction oriented that, and not only oftentimes do Americans not lead with relationship building, but really focus on tasks first. And I think that through globalization, we're exporting that culture around the world, and that gives a lot of countries concern about American business culture. And I think there's a good reason to be concerned for it, because I think it's unhealthy. And that's what we see in the biology and the research. If we don't lead and value and be intentional about relationship building, then there's a much higher probability that our bodies are going to be in the state of stress response that's very unhealthy. I think people feel that, but they don't necessarily understand the biological implications. But if they did, I think they would have even greater conviction about really encouraging a culture that prioritizes and places importance on relationships.
Thank you. Coming to the staff and students from Temasek Polytechnic, do you have a question?
Hi, Michael.
Hello.
Good morning. My name is Norani, and I'm one of the lecturers at Temasek Polytechnic. Yeah, and with me are all the staff from engineering school. You all want to wave at him? Yes, and we are doing a workshop today on understanding cross-culture. Okay, so my question is, when you explain about culture of control and culture of connection, and how leaders can create culture of connection, it's excellent, but I'm wondering for those who are not at the senior position, those who are probably at the middle management position, how can someone create leadership when that person is in a position of more authoritative figure or leadership or management in a culture? Because as you know, we have generational gap, cultural gap, and how can someone still, for example, create an avenue where there are two voices when that person is not at the senior position to create such leadership? Is my question clear?
Yeah, it is. It's a very good question too, and there are, I think, two aspects of it. One is if you're interacting with someone who doesn't value connection, it's very difficult to get them to really change. Absent pain usually will require them to change if the circumstances require it. So, but what we also find in culture is that when you look at the research, in every organization you will find cultures of control, cultures of indifference, and cultures of connection. And there is, when you look at the data, there are large standard deviations between the degrees of connection and engagement across the organization. And that tells us one thing, which is most organizations are not intentional about culture building from a relational and a connection standpoint. And so we just get a wide variation across the organization. And the good news about that is that creating a connection culture, it's ideal if it starts at the top, certainly. But oftentimes it doesn't. And it's the culture that you work in a day-to-day basis, the people that you interact with that have the greatest impact on you. And so that's also the culture that you can have the greatest influence on changing. So whether you're a team leader or a leader of a department, or you're an individual in the department who wants to create greater connection, that's the culture that you need to focus on. Don't worry about the things you can't control. Don't worry about the CEO. Don't worry about the department leaders who are remote, who it's hard for you to access or have conversations with. Focus on the culture that you're in and changing, becoming an intentional connector. What we talk about in our research is that there are three types of people. There are intentional disconnectors in life, and psychiatrists call them the dark triad. They're sociopaths, narcissists, and Machiavellians. The one thing they have in common is that they all have difficulty feeling the emotions of other people. They really, there's some, in a sense, some brain damage there, that part of their brain that has neurotransmitters, mirror neurons, they're not able to sense and feel what other people feel. Oftentimes dangerous. But fortunately, that's a small percent of the population. Most of us are unintentional disconnectors. We have blind spots, things we do that are disconnecting. It could be that we're over-controlling. It could be that we're hypercritical personalities. It could be that we have a hard time expressing what we believe. We're afraid to speak up. Those things are all blind spots that we have to learn to grow past and develop character to become an intentional connector, which is the highest form of a connector. So the good news in our research, and other organizations have pointed this out too, is that it's the team culture, the departmental culture that has the greatest effect on us. And that's also the culture that we can have the greatest influence on.
We have time maybe just for one question. I see Jaden from Republic, and I also see Dita May from the Philippine Public Service Commission, Civil Service Commission. I'm not sure who would like to have the privilege of the last question. Could you indicate to me if you would prefer to have that opportunity?
Yes, nice to meet you, Mr. Michael. My name is Jaden from Republic Polytechnic in Singapore. All right. Thank you for your lecture, first of all. I have a question. I know those three V three V models could be applicable to our organizations as well. But how can we deal with someone who prefers to work alone? Because connection must involve in the active relationship with employees, right? But for those employees who prefer to work alone without any participation, how can we manage them effectively more?
Just a couple things to think about. Number one, in the job that that individual is in, do they really need collaboration? I think of, I started my career out at Texas Instruments, and I know I worked with semiconductor design engineers that really didn't have to interact with other people all that much. They had a job that was primarily focused on them. There wasn't a lot of collaboration required. So it's more acceptable if they're loners, if they have that type of job, and maybe they perform best. But it's also helpful to, if you see them isolating themselves and it's starting to affect their mood, if it's if they're having trouble interacting with other people and they become irritable, that's a sign that because there are really some biological things that are happening that are unhealthy for them and for the organization. So that's the type of thing where I think is good to perhaps get a copy of our book or help. There are also some great TED videos online. I think of one by John Cacioppo from the University of Chicago that talks about the power of connection. There's been helping people understand that they're hardwired to connect, and we definitely see that in the American culture. People are becoming much lonelier. We have the highest percentage of people living alone in U.S. history. It's about 28% of the households. People are just suffering from a connection deficit. So it is, if you find people who, and as a manager, I've experienced this too. I've had some employees who actually developed drug and alcohol. When I became more involved and got to know, also struggling with loneliness. And so I became involved in, we got counselors involved to try to help them because they were, in a sense, self-sabotaging their lives and their performance at work because of these issues. So I hope that's helpful. Just a couple ways to think about it. Number one, is their job one that requires a lot of interaction? And if it doesn't, it's probably not as important that you get involved. But if you start to see them going down and having problems, then it's good to intervene and really think about these issues. They could just be struggling from loneliness.
Hi, my name is
Hello.
Debbie. Hi, from Debbie. I'm from Temasek Poly. I'm teaching in the humanities. And I have two related questions. Two questions, but they are somewhat related. The first question is, how do you influence or how do you use some of your these principles that you have that you've shared, connection principles with how do you use these principles to influence some very powerful leaders who do not practice these principles, who actually fit into what you have described as the flip side of the not using connection principle and having some self-interest, maybe, so that's one. The other question is linked to what you had mentioned about you working with Pfizer, for example, an MNC. How do you, maybe perhaps use how do you influence Pfizer if there are issues with compliance, let's say in some of these subsidiaries outside the US, which have very different cultural, background. For example, China. If there are, how do you work with them to influence them if they where compliance issues are concerned, where you find companies with in China, Pfizer subsidiaries? Maybe if they have compliance issues, how do you use these principles to so-called make some changes? Is it possible at all, given the cultural difference, you know?
Well, let me answer the first question. How do you deal, because this will be shorter, how do you deal with people who are the opposite, the intentional? And you quite honestly, there's nothing you can do to change them. You can't persuade them. It's best to work around them. If you have hiring and firing authority and you find they're intentional disconnectors and you have no hope they're going to change, then my approach would be that they don't share the values of the organization, shouldn't be there. So that would be my answer. They are actually hurting productivity and employees, having a negative effect on them. That's my approach.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
We have come to the end of this highly engaging live webinar. Viewers, thank you so much for participating in this complimentary live webinar brought to you by STADA and the Center for Transcultural Studies at Temasek Poly. This video will be uploaded on STADA's YouTube account for your viewing. Just search for STADA, you will find the video. LinkedIn users, again, you can join this group called Community Spirit. One for the road. In the wise words of Simon Sinek, when people are financially invested, they want a return. When people are emotionally invested, they want to contribute. Till our next live webinar in August, when we talk about how to do mentoring differently, leveraging on technology to do mentoring. In the words of my favorite hero, Mahatma Gandhi, live as if you were to die tomorrow, learn as if you are to live forever, so keep on connecting. This is Sally Chiu, your moderator, disconnecting from the Local Connect Village, the connecting place here at Temasek Polytechnic. Have a wonderful day, everybody.